Hi everyone, how's it going? It's me again on the Stars and Startups podcast. I'm your host, Varun Vumidi. Today we chat with the CEO of ixigo, a business that can be truly called a travel industry veteran in India. Alok and Rajneesh have been in the travel ecosystem since the time they graduated from the IIT in 2001. They've been building ixigo for over 14 years, building a travel business frugally, hacking their way through many industry and business cycles. Have created an ecosystem of apps that have become leaders in their space to serve 170 million users in their lifetime. In this conversation, Alok shares his journey of starting up, getting through previous cycles, and lessons that can be used to navigate the current situation. Let's hear from Alok Bajpai. Hey Alok, welcome to the show.
Hi Varun, thank you for having me.
You're someone who loves travel and you've spent so much time in this industry. Lockdown must be hard on you because you really can't leave maybe 2,000 square feet of space.
Yeah, so definitely it's a change that we've all been adapting to. I think people feel that folks in the travel industry travel a lot, but we wish we got more time to travel ourselves. We're too busy helping others travel. But it's been very interesting to see how this entire change has brought the whole industry together, and also as things open up, we are seeing very interesting green shoots. We'll talk more about it.
Did you always aspire to go to an IIT?
Yeah, I think I was in 8th standard when my dad, we used to live in Kanpur actually. So my dad took me to a tour of the IIT campus. And it was a really serene, calm, environment, unlike the rest of Kanpur, which if you've ever been there, is probably one of the most hustling, bustling cities, in the hinterland. So, that place really kind of impressed me in terms of me wanting to be there at some point. And of course, by the time you were in high school, those were the days when you either had to become an engineer or a doctor, or your parents made you feel that you're not doing justice to your work, right? So I think there was some, obviously, I wouldn't say there was too much pressure from the parents, but I had this aspiration of my own because I really love maths. Good with science, I don't think. But engineering is something that I definitely wanted to do. By the time I was in 11th, I was very clear that that's what I'm made for in life. Yeah. Building.
So you had this interest in building stuff. You're like, okay, I need to go to engineering college to do that. And were you set on IIT?
Yeah, that was the aspiration. I actually did also get through BITS Pilani because I was also one of the top rankers in 12th standard. And that was the year where JEE got cancelled and had to be redone. So interestingly, I spent a month at BITS Pilani and then got the JEE result and then moved back to IIT Kanpur. And I still remember that 1 month was very interesting, spent in a small town in Rajasthan, again, a very nice campus. But yeah, I was hell bent on going to IIT. So that IIT Kanpur in those days was the best, engineering college in India by far, because computer science and all that, we had the best mainframes and the best computer science infrastructure. So that's something I really wanted to get into. Yeah.
Okay, so you had like a key interest even in computers at that time. Because I know when you graduated from IIT, you got a job as a software developer at Amadeus, right? Was that a campus placement? Was that like, okay, day one, day zero, what is the placement?
Yeah, so it was actually quite weird. So we got a out of campus sort of opportunity where people had to apply to, and this was very rare. So we applied to those. This was at that time we didn't even know what Amadeus did, honestly, but we knew that this was France and beautiful place by the Mediterranean, so it piqued our interest. We applied to it, and then we got interviews done in Delhi, and then these guys actually flew the final round shortlist to Nice for a week and floored us with floored us with their campus and the beautiful scenery around, and I think that's what made us join them. Only later we discovered that they are the largest travel technology provider in the world for airlines. So it was, yeah, very interesting journey. Computers, my love for computers began very early. My dad had the foresight to put me into a computer course for kids back when I was 8 years old on a Macintosh. So we had a institute near our home which was offering this, and we used to live in Kenya back then. So in Mombasa, we had a small institute that I went to for my first experience with computers, and I was intrigued ever since. And so even in school, I did spend a lot of time in the computer lab, and then at IIT, you would find me more often sitting in the com center than the library, for instance.
Oh wow! Okay, was it mostly like gaming or just writing code? What were you doing?
Writing code, figuring out ethical hacking techniques, just figuring out how things work, right? I mean, that's something that I've always been passionate about, like just figuring out, okay, we had Linux, very early days of Linux back then, 97, 98, I'm talking about, like Linux itself was maybe a couple of years old. And, just being able to compile a OS yourself, etc., gave a lot of hype in those days.
But when you look at 2000, that was like the bubble also for the US, right? The first crash, the US. So there was a lot of demystification of technology in itself at that time. Did that dissuade you at all? That maybe this is temporary?
So actually, actually the bubble crashed. It started to crash around middle of 2001 when we had already graduated, but I think there were early signs, and then I think it was only after September 11 that things really collapsed in terms of the economy. So I think at the time we graduated, the economy was doing fairly well. At the time when we got jobs, which was end of 2000, and very quickly after that, the environment degraded. So we were just lucky to have jobs at that stage. We actually won a business plan competition, like me and a couple of other colleagues, in January 2001. And, there were a bunch of angels who wanted to give us some money to play with that. But then because of what was happening in the US, that didn't work out. So the job opportunity was the next best option, obviously.
Oh, so you had the entrepreneurial bug in college itself, and you kind of looked at building a startup right out of college. Maybe drop out.
So well, we had this first business plan competition ever at IIT, and we had a couple of IIT Kanpur alumni who would come from Silicon Valley to judge it, and we were first runner-up, so second prize essentially at that competition, and there was talks of angel money and all that going on for getting like $25,000 to start up something. At that time, it was I think just enthusiasm, and we didn't even know how to write a business plan, to be honest.
Sure. So you go to Nice and join Amadeus, right? And you work in the team for a couple of years. Is that when you and Rajneesh bonded? And what was the genesis of ixigo? Because I'm sure you're obviously just focusing on it's your first job. You're building tech. It's a new environment. There's a lot going on, and I think you also went on to do your MBA at INSEAD, right? And that's one of the top universities in Western Europe as well at that time.
Right. Rajneesh, he was my hostel wingmate. In fact, he was a sidie, so the next room to mine in hostel, and for all the 4 years actually. So Rajneesh I knew very, very well, and we did get along, and we had a common love for everything computing, and it so happened that we both landed a job at Amadeus together, right? So Rajneesh, in fact, was not well around the time when we had to go and join, and so he wanted to you know rethink about his joining. And I was like, dude, once in a lifetime opportunity, we need to go. Let's get packing, right? So we actually joined together, and we ended up taking a flat together as well. So we were flatmates for 4 years. So that sort of made the bonding stronger because we were never roommates earlier. We were just wingmates. But I think when you do the dishes together, or you end up, you know, uh, um, spending more time, I think that's what led to more creative ideas around things. And we always wanted to do something together at some point, but the opportunity only came after I finished my business school. And honestly, one of the reasons that led me to think about it was that I didn't land a job that I really wanted. So interviewed for a lot of consulting firms, and most of them told me that I can't think straight. So didn't really make it to my dream big four consulting jobs. And then um, I decided to move back to India immediately because I said that if I want to do something else in industry or do something of my own, it's gonna be then in India, because India was looking like the most exciting place to be.
Right.
Continues to be, actually, even now. So yeah, I moved back. I actually first joined a mid-sized travel technology company. Wanted to stay close to travel. That was an industry I really developed a love for during my stint at Amadeus. And then, kept in touch with Rajneesh on calls and Skype and all that. And we just had one moment in 2006 when everything fell into place, and we said, let's do it right now, right? So decided to just go and quit my job. So I'd worked for almost 8 months by then in that job, but the bug was already there.
Yeah.
And then convinced Rajneesh to also quit and fly down here. Yeah, that's how things started.
So in that time, 2006, like you mentioned, where things kind of fell into place, I would imagine very few investors and angels were in India. But thinking about it, in 2006, there were PE funds which probably have a very different mindset. But India was still opening up to technology, etc. It was mostly your Infosys and your TCSs, etc. that kind of had, and there was obviously the BPOs where a lot of investment had gone in from global players. So how did you navigate that? How was the first year for you?
Yeah, so it was a tough fundraise environment for two reasons. One is that three OTAs had already raised money by the time we launched. So there was, in fact, four. So Clear Trip, Make My Trip, Yatra, Travel Guru. Um, Three of them are still around. And the other thing was that I think in general there were like very few VC funds, very few early stage investors in India. Like, you could literally count them on your finger, right? And we had we actually met all of them. Probably there were like 8 or 9 of those. We had met all of those, and I think most of them uh, either did not understand what we were trying to build, because we had at that time wanted to build a meta search, which was something that even the Western world had only seen for 2 or 3 years in the shape of Kayak or Skyscanner, right? And I think for India to digest whether this space, I mean, I think the question people were struggling with was whether the online travel market itself is big enough. Because back then we are talking about 30 million internet users, and, and then people are doing their math saying, okay, 10% उसमें से flight ticket book कर लेंगे, so how big is that market and all of that.
That's when I think even Deccan had just started, right? Like, if you remember Deccan Air, and I think that was kind of the entry point for a lot of people start flying because it is affordable. It started becoming affordable at that time, right?
Absolutely. So Air Deccan had started. You had Sahara, and you had a couple of other players. But yeah, that was the starting point for the industry. And then you had Kingfisher that took over Deccan, and you had Jet Airways that continued to do well after that for a while. So the market was just getting started, even from an aviation perspective. You're right, which is why it was very hard to convince the airlines also on a new business model. Like, people are used to the agency business model, and they were used to it. it was very hard to convince them to come on board a meta model or a lead gen model or of sorts. So it was a double whammy for us because we were building something which was so blue ocean that people would not even know how to work with us, right? so um, so yeah, I think the first 1 year was very hard from a fundraise perspective. I mean, we ended up raising some angel money from family, friends, and um, I wouldn't call them fools because they gave us money, but the three Fs essentially.
Yeah.
Um, uh, but that was largely the set we raised our first few $100,000 from, and both of us were actually in a lot of financial duress ourselves. So I used up all my savings on the business school fees, and I still had a loan, in fact, to pay off from that. And secondly, Rajneesh was also going through some, financial needs of his own in his family. That was, for both of us, like it was a drag on our personal savings and resources beyond a point. But thankfully, we had this network of amazing friends and colleagues and ex-colleagues and who actually came and supported. And most of those guys actually later on in the journey exited at fairly good returns as well. So
The first, the genesis of the idea itself, right? Kind of the business models that you started seeing in, say, the US and some of these Western markets. Was this what you uh, kind of identified while working on Amadeus, or was it like, hey, we're back, we're looking to do something, and this seems to be a good starting point for us? What was the genesis of Ixigo?
So actually, when Rajneesh and I were working for Amadeus, we used to travel a lot. So the good thing about French companies is they give you a lot of vacation. So we used to make the most of them. Like we literally traveled to almost every country in Western Europe during that time, and we would travel mostly by flights because you had EasyJet and many other low cost carriers, right, in Europe. And most of the time, we would use some of the emerging meta searches ourselves because those seem to be, better in terms of saving time and money. Um, so as a consumer, we fell in love with that concept the moment we ourselves started using it, and the concept itself was probably just a year or two old at that time. In India, there was probably there was Rediff trying to build something similar, but there was not real any meta search player that had emerged by then. And we felt that as there'll be multiple OTAs and multiple airlines, there'll be a scope for a meta search even in the Indian context, and that's why we kind of took a bet on that. Um, I think the real value add of working for travel tech earlier was that we could design or architect our systems better, and I think Rajneesh and team did a really fantastic job at kind of creating the first uh, 2.0 kind of application. Like back then, there was a vast difference between how Ixigo used to work and how some of the other OTAs used to work, given we were always ahead in terms of implementation of new things. Like Ajax was something very new back then. Being able to asynchronously load the results rather than waiting for multiple things to happen, was a big user experience wow. And also being able to see more accurate information because people would use caching very suboptimally. So you would see fares that did not exist anymore by the time you went to buy them.
Right.
So some of these small problems we solved them actually better than people who are out there. It was not just a meta search concept, but also a function of new tech innovations that we adopted quite fast, which we felt would create a vast enough difference for people to come and try us out. So that's what our thesis was back then. Yeah.
I've heard you call yourself the Google for travel back in the day. Uh, so you were obviously helping get the best results for travel, probably the best options for the customer. Did you get users right away? They love the simplicity. Um, what was that experience like?
Sure. So on the day we launched, actually, we ran Ixigo from servers that were sitting in our office, right? Because we just wanted to test the waters, and we sent out a few friends a link to the site, and the site was hosted from servers in the office, and we said, try this out, check this out, right, on the day of launch.
Yeah.
Some of our friends liked it so much they actually sent it out to their entire offices and friends and family networks. Now, one of the guys worked at Microsoft, and he sent everyone at Microsoft India an email to check it out. So we got like thousands of hits on, like not really a server class machine sitting in our office on a DSL connection of 512 kb, which was state of the art back then. So it was interesting days. Like probably almost brought the site down, right? Almost crashed day one. And I think what happened very quickly is we realized that word of mouth was very, very strong in the first. I think the first month itself, we got like 30,000 plus users. Within I think 4 to 5 months, we had scaled to 100,000 monthly active users or more. And this was all organic. I mean, we didn't have any money when we started, so it was all bootstrapped. So we didn't really spend anything on Google until probably middle of 2008, right? So it was interesting to see that SEO and word of mouth alone started bringing a lot of traffic, and basis that traffic, we were also able to then go and sign up airlines. I think our first airline signed up within 3 months of launch.
How do you guys define that Rajneesh is going to handle tech and you're going to handle business? Was that because you had an MBA and you're like, hey guys, this is how we split?
Yes, the guy who's a better programmer gets to be the CTO. It's as simple as that. And I think the guy who goes to business school by default goes to CEO. I don't think we ever formally because I did try to write a few lines of code in the early days. But my passion to learn more things was more on the business and partnership side,
right.
Because that would be a better use of my degree. And I think Rajneesh's passion has always been technology and innovation. So, and till this day, I think that continues to be the case. Yeah. Like marketing in my mind was also a hacking problem. I mean, today we start calling it growth hacking, but believe you me, like I was looking at this back in 2007 as a hacking problem. Like, how do you hack the SEO algorithm and rank better on Google? How do you kind of hack PR and start appearing in news, right? Because when you don't have money, you have to hack everything, right? Right. So marketing was the other area I was very passionate about from day one, and for the first 1 or 2 years, I was doing all the nuts and bolts myself on that.
Well, sales is the most important skill, right? And if you're, and currently, I believe ixigo has 170 million users, who use the platform, and relatively with very little burn compared to some of the other players out there. And for a model that and I want to probe you a little bit about how you kind of evolved the product, right, from being Meta to what it is today. But what was the key tenets to having this 170 million users? So you brought up hacking, marketing. What were some of the things that you did to be able to drive this kind of user growth?
Yeah, so I think in hindsight, there's just three things that have really worked for us. I mean, one is that you start by letting your product do your marketing, right? So if your product is not as good as anyone else in the market, there's no reason why people come to you, right? So we've always tried to have a differentiating edge or a major UX edge over our competitors, and at times we've always taken bets too. I mean, the joke in our companies, we always take bets too early. And sometimes that's also not great. But we've been one of those that whether it was mobile, whether it was apps, whether it was betting on the next billion users on trains, or whether it was voice, which we are working on now, we've been proud of taking those bets very early on. Because I think as founders, if your gut instinct, and some of these bets are really about saying, hey, my gut says this is going to work, right? And you start taking it because no matter how much analysis you do, it's it's very hard to justify some of those bets at the time when you took them. Because at that time the revenue contribution for most of those things would be in less than 1%, right, when they launch. So so I think and that gives us an edge against larger companies who will be I think more risk averse in taking those kind of bets and putting enough resources around it. Because whether it's a large player or a small player, the number of engineers who work on a very very hard problem which hasn't been solved yet is typically the same, which is probably about two or four. So so you're actually competing with just two guys and four guys. It doesn't matter how large the other player looks like. So I think our approach has always been, understand the market better than your competitors. We actually never even looked at our competitors in terms of what they were doing, which at times is perhaps the other reason why we've kind of been ahead, because we realize those things looking just at the market and the consumers and their sentiment and their behavior. Till this day, I think both of us and many leadership team members go and read all the Play Store reviews ourselves to figure out, what the voice of the customer is really saying. So I think that staying close to the customer, I would say customer centricity, people call it empathy. You could it also starts coming across as customer experience when you start building the product to support that. But that's been like the second big reason. We've been very very customer centric in our approach. We've not shied away from pivoting in one direction if the market is telling us that, ever. And I think that's the reason why we're still around, because it's a series of small pivots that kept us growing year on year and, kept us chugging along. And the third thing I would say is that, we've been extremely frugal in our mindset in how we've built stuff. It's not by design when we started. When we started, we always had the ambition, like everybody else, to keep raising more and more money and to burn it and grow faster. But since we were unable to do that in our early years, we ended up making hard choices that led us to learn things the hard way, right? So how do you market without money? How do you hire the best engineers without, paying them like higher than everybody else in the market, right? I mean, boils down to these kind of problems and situations, when you're building companies. And I think that led you to build a muscle that works very differently, whether it is our content marketing or video marketing capability that we built over time, and that's been built over the last 6 years, right? Or whether it is our app marketing and distribution capability, or whether it is just our ability to do more with less, right? So we've got 150 people serving, like the almost 30 million monthly active users, right? So I think it boils down to these three things, which some of them were by design, but the others actually were because of circumstances.
Hey guys, this is a public service message. I'd love for you to leave your email on stars.substack.com so that we can update you whenever I release a new episode. If you haven't already done so on your favorite podcast player, do subscribe so that you can stay in touch and listen to all the amazing speakers that I have on my show. Okay, back to the show. So when you're talking about by design, I also know you're a big proponent of company culture, etc. I mean, having and you don't talk about that too much, and a lot of companies don't. But if you look at what you guys have done, 14-year journey from 2006 to 2020 now, and you're still around, right? As a privately kind of funded business. When did that start? When did the thought process start? And did you put anything in place for that to kind of, because culture sometimes evolves and then becomes standard, but then you can do something, in a very conscious effort, right? What was your take on that?
Yeah, so I think again, I talked about the three things that led us to continue growing year on year and evolving. But if you look at the core of what made us get to where we are, it's really been our people, right? And the culture that those people have built over time, right? So the way I look at culture now is that it's not the poster that you hang on your walls with 10 things that you stand for. It's actually how you live and breathe every single day. What kind of decisions you take. Who do you hire, who do you fire, who do you promote, right? And how you do it. What do you celebrate? What do you chide publicly? What kind of decisions do you take, and how long do you take in taking them? Do people show up on time? These are the small things that actually create culture, right? So I think back in the days, one thing that both Rajneesh and I agreed on was that we should be very anal about hiring. And even if we don't find somebody good for 3-4 months, we're not going to hire somebody suboptimal for the job. And in our early years, some of the people we hire actually they were really, really good. I mean, some of them went on to start their own companies, which they've even like made successful and sold already, right? So we are proud that we could find and spot such kind of engineers and people who were self starters, people who could think. Actually, all our engineers that we hired, one of the benchmarks we used was, can this person think all the way till product, right? So it's very rare to find engineers who can think a little bit like product managers at time to time, but in the early days we actually hired a lot of such people, and what that does is that it creates autonomy. People can take their own decisions, and in the best interest of the product, right? And they can also think more horizontally than just at the component or feature level, right? So so I think that was one thing which helped us build a very strong engineering and product culture, right? So across all teams there is a product way of thinking about things, right? And that's where the primary hat for even a business guy or a sales guy or a content person, would be like, what does it do to the product, right? To do this deal or to get this content on. And I think that's been key to building the product engineering organization internally. And of course, keeping the benchmarks very, very high on hiring is super critical for that. It's very painful because it slows you down, and so that's the other thing. We are very, very slow at hiring. We take months sometimes to fill roles, but I think over time we've also figured out that it's better to do that than to be on the other side where you've hired a lot of people, and some of them are not performing as what you expected them to, which is a function over hiring. So that's one, and then the rest is like during all the events which were ever, or let's say when we went through the financial crisis in 2008, or just before this COVID situation erupted. Like we've been extremely transparent at all times with our team. And when I say team, it's not just like the people who report into the two of us, but the entire team, right? Like we typically will do a town hall or all hands meet and tell everyone exactly how much runway we have and what we need to do to increase that, right? Rather than having a kind of very high level discussion where people still go back with doubts in their head. So in 2008, like we told people that we had a broken term sheet for Series A, and then the financial crisis happened. It was September 2008, and we had a small town hall. Like we were 25 people, and we said, look, we're going to run out of cash in 3-4 months if we don't do something, right? And then we found a way to survive that over the next 1 year, and we came out on the other side. I mean, these kind of events also build your culture. In a very, very like it becomes a myth that everybody sort of remembers, but it's or a legend, so to say.
I've seen a lot of successful startups spawn other startups, right? So there was a lot written about the citrus mafia. I don't know, because I think it started off with PayPal, and then And I've seen, okay, like a large company like Flipkart has, a lot of people who go on and do other things. Um,
Yeah.
I've seen a few, and I think you call them exigems, who
Yeah. Yeah.
start other things. You just mentioned they've gone on to, you've found the entrepreneurial spirit in some folks, and they've gone on to do other things. Do you back them publicly? Do you give them their seed round? How how do you handhold them?
Yeah. So, what we've seen is that people who come with a long-term mindset when they join us, and who prove their commitment and with the passion that they have, which is similar to a founder's passion, we find them as natural, future entrepreneurs. And typically those people would have stayed with us for 5-6 years and seen like at least a couple of ups and downs in the journey, because that's what builds their entrepreneurial muscle as well. Um, so when these people actually decide to move on, even though it's very painful for us, because by that time they've become like a pillar for us in our company. But the one single reason which we always tell people, we never stop people from leaving, is that they are starting something of their own. So we actually kind of encourage it. We're proud that we have at least 20 such companies that have come out. Couple of them in stealth mode at this point, but at least five of them, fairly successful and doing well even at this point. But there are at least 20 such businesses out there started by exigems or ex-exigems, as we say. Um, and I think what's interesting is that in some of those companies, they've carried on that cultural code, which is I think something that makes us proud. That if we built some a cultural code that we are all proud of, and they've also kind of adopted it, and not just adopted it, now they're kind of spreading that by doing it in their companies. So I think it's good for the ecosystem in general to encourage that. I mean, if you look at the Valley, that's how the Valley got built. In many cases, we've actually either like given these companies an angel round, me and Rajneesh, or we've done a lot of mentoring and hand-holding support, and putting them in touch with investors and things like that. So we do try to help as much as our limited time allows. Um, and I foresee that it will continue happening, given that's become an aspiration now for our best engineers, saying that, look, this is a place I can come here, spend 5 years, learn, and then move on and do something of my own. It's the best learning ground because you get a lot of responsibility, cross-functional exposure. So it's actually become a great way to also attract good talent, like entrepreneurial talent, who actually wants to do that someday. Yeah.
When you've obviously seen the ups and downs in the market, and now you're at a point where again travel is disrupted, business itself is disrupted, right?
Yeah.
Because it's not like any of the earlier kind of calamities, right?
Yeah.
And there's a question mark on how travel will look in the future, at least in the near future. So, were there any learnings from, like, your earlier cycles that you're kind of using now?
Yes. So I think that way you can say we've been a bit lucky to be unlucky in the past, right? If you've gone through, that kind of pain before, that. So there are two things that every crisis teaches you. That number one is that you need to act decisively and swiftly before it hits you, right? If you can see it coming. And we did that back in 2008 when we actually did that town hall, and everybody agreed to sort of work at half their salaries for almost a year. I think 9 months at least, right? And
Yeah.
and in return we gave them ESOPs, and those guys actually in Series A, those guys actually also saw liquidity. Some of those guys later on started their own companies. So, uh, but the learning was that, look, if we'd not swiftly told the team what we were going through, we would not solve the problem together, right? So I think that instead of sitting on the problem and just being anxious about it as founders and losing your sleep over it, I think the moment you share it and your team also feels it's their problem, it also helps some of the burden shift to everybody else to help find a solution.
Right.
And also it sends a signal, like you might come out as vulnerable in front of your team, but later on if they realize that it's not something of your doing, they're not going to put the blame on you, right? They're going to say the situation was adverse and people were transparent, so we should help. And we've seen this time and again, right? So even in this particular crisis, our immediate reaction was that we need to tell the team that, look, if we have zero revenue, this is how long we'll last, right? And therefore, what do we do to bring down our cost to last longer? And the team was fairly supportive again, and we managed to at least so far, ride the tide and continue our journey. And we expect that as the market opens up, things will look better. The second thing is that what do you do in terms of rewarding that team is also extremely critical, right? Because if the team comes and shares your pain, you also need to make sure they get upside. So in all our crises, we have actually given more ESOP to team members who stick around. And we've seen that very, very small percentage actually leave during your difficult times. And then you realize that some of those are not people you would want on your team any which ways for the long term if they can't survive one blow. So I think it also teaches you to identify who your most loyal and supportive folks are, and double down on them, right? Essentially, make sure that those people are well incentivized for the long run. So yeah, I think that's the key learnings there.
So when you came out of 2010, right? I think around that time you also raised a round of funding from Make My Trip. Around that time, was
2011, yeah, from Safe and Make My Trip, yes.
So was that because you needed a strategic partner to survive another kind of downturn and a blow? What was the strategy there? Because you're not necessarily competing, but you're also at least at that time you were still an aggregator, so you want to be a neutral party, right? Aggregators get the most value being a neutral party. So how did that go down, and what was the thought behind that?
Right. So actually, we got approached by Saif, who's a VC, and Make My Trip at the same time, and we also considered the fact that we were A, non-competing at that time, and B, it was a minority investment with very limited rights attached to the strategic. So we did not really give away any kind of rights that would not allow us to pursue an independent path of our own. And secondly, there was a VC coming in as well who would always have incentives aligned for building for the long term. So I think we went down that path because obviously we needed more capital, but B, we felt at that time, and which also holds true, is that there's always value in having a partner which you can also build more commercial relationship with over time. And for a while, we did work with Make My Trip on several initiatives, on hotels and other areas, international flights, etc. And since later on we became more of an OTA. That's more recent. So I think what happened is that we started as a Meta. Meta works beautifully on desktop because you can open new sites in another tab and continue the journey. The moment you come on mobile, the Meta experience kind of breaks, right? So around 2012, when we saw mobile emerging as a channel, and 2013, 14, it became evident that, A, the airlines would always have very clunky mobile websites, and B, the deep linking experience was not very optimal. Even today, app deep linking, at times it works, at times it doesn't. So we quickly realized that if mobile was the future, if that was the platform for the future, then apps would be the engines for the growth. And if you have an app, it's a captive ecosystem where you are better off, managing the entire transactional funnel yourself, because that is what your customer expects. So we could see that writing on the wall back in 2014, 2015, that we need to double down on mobile apps and transactions rather than just being a aggregator lead gen platform. So I think over time, obviously we've become more competitive than before, but also I think over time their stake has gone down because we've also brought in capital from other investors to maintain a great equilibrium on that front. Yeah.
ixigo has a very solid train booking application. Uh, what was the thought process there? Because it's kind of, well, India pretty much takes buses and trains. Flights is still, for a small segment. And I'm guessing of the 170 million, 80% is probably on those two apps, right, using trains and buses. So was that the thought process to say, okay, we need to cater to a larger India, and which is why we're doing this?
So back in the days when we were a meta search, when we used to analyze Google search queries for SEO hacking, we would see that very large number of searches in India, disproportionately larger than flights, used to be for train related information, right? And people would go to the official website, but the user experience and the ability to mine into the right information was very limited, on the official website. So we saw a clear opportunity that once mobile becomes dominant, building a utility and transaction app centered around train at the core would be a game changer, because 90% of Indians have never taken a flight in their life. Probably even 1 or 2 years later, 5 years later, that answer will be 80% and not like substantially different, because from a average income standpoint, most people cannot afford to fly, and that's a hard reality of this country. So around 2014, when we actually had launched this app, our thesis was that if we actually end up growing this part of the segment fast enough, at some point it would disrupt, the upper part of the pyramid. So if you look at a pyramid and you say that flights is relevant for the first 100 million users, right? But the next billion users, are going to be all about trains and maybe buses and budget hotels and things which are, let's say, pilgrimages, and it's a very different market segment. It's more vernac as well in terms of how you need to think about it. These are people using lower end or mid end Android devices, so you got to keep your app lightweight, and you also need to create a lot of informational use cases there, because for that segment, portals like TripAdvisor or existing large OTAs do not provide enough information as well, because they might have the information that guy actually wants is key. If I'm taking this train from Patna station, which platform shall I go and stand on, and where is my coach going to be, right? Because that's the most relevant information he's seeking at that time. And then if he's going for pilgrimage to Shirdi, he wants to know the timings of the temple and whether he can stay somewhere nearby, right? That's the kind of information you wouldn't find on most of the OTA platforms back when we started that train app. So the idea was to start as a utility app, not a transactional app. Actually, if you look at the entire ixigo journey, one thing which is unique and has helped us immensely is that since we were product focused, we always thought about the informational use case or the utility use case first and built for that, and then moved to transactions once we had a significant amount of traffic coming in organically for those utility use cases. That story played out on flights, and the same story actually played out on trains, where we launched for very simple use cases like running status and PNR status. And we started using our own users' locations. So the interesting thing is, as you grow, enough number of ixigo users are sitting inside trains, and you can use their location to tell others where the train is. And over time, what happens is you've mined so many locations out there that you can now even just see the cell tower ID that you're seeing on Geo and tell people where the train is. So they don't need network, they don't need GPS, they just need they need the network, but they don't need a 4G to be on. They don't need internet to be on. if we just see the cell tower number uh, for that telco, we can actually tell you where the train is because we've already got like a massive database of cell towers in the country, right? So with these kind of innovations, we were able to uh, create a very unique system around train information and predictions. A large part of it is actually AI driven, where we mine all this data and then use machine learning to start predicting. Okay, if the train is at this point, how late is it? Yeah, how late is it likely to be now? Because in India, it's very hard to tell. So
The trains have their own schedules also.
yes. So by solving for utility, right, we growth hack again. It was a growth hack to solve for utility because
Sure.
transactions is a little bit harder. You have to first get the PGs and the transactional funnels in place, and it takes a little while. But information is a great hack to start bringing the traffic in, and then you use these kind of crowdsourced use cases to build the stickiness, and then you get into transactions. So we did that in 2017, and I think day one when we got into transactions, we became like the second biggest partner for IRCTC on the transactions, like the day we launched, and continue to be, at this point. So I think at the core, utility or value to the customer remains more important for us in whatever we build. Uh, Transactions is a great way to build that relationship with the customer and offer him some value, but may not be the only reason why people actually use Ixigo. That's the key insight.
That's fantastic. It's so exciting to see, how the products have kind of evolved and helped the growth. The most important part going into this recession slash, challenge, uh, are you profitable? Are you going to be able to come out, uh, fine? Because I know that you've constantly been, you've kept the team quite light, right? You still have a very lean team.
Yes.
So, you don't have too much of a monthly recurring burden, like a cost.
Yes.
So, are you better prepared this time around? Are you, do you have to go for another fundraise to kind of, ensure that you stay, on the top of the game?
Yeah. So I think, like I said, we've been lucky to have gone through the pain in the past and built the muscle and the habits that can keep you alive in the next crisis. Um, we are also quite kind of lucky to have turned profitable, at a EBITDA or operating profit level, both, early Jan. So JFM, we actually made enough profits to give us some additional runway over and above what we already had. Uh, so, at this point, I'll say, given the market has opened up and we can see some week on week trend lines on how domestic flight bookings are taking off or how trains are trending, we are fairly confident that we are going to come out, quite fine on the other side, and much better or maybe even faster than many of the other OTAs. The reason being, see, the larger you are in terms of your fixed cost base, the bigger your problems are in today's world. And the larger you are in terms of hotels, holidays, or international flights, you're sitting on much larger problems because those things are going to come back last. Our business is centered largely around transportation, flights and trains, and with some hotels and buses thrown in. But largely, like we depend on people going from one place to another in India using a flight or a train. Now, a large part of that demand still exists because there are utility use cases and essential use cases, as well as meeting your friends and family use cases, or your boyfriend or girlfriend is in another city. Those sort of use cases. So again, some of that will continue to happen, even if leisure travel takes a few more months to come back. So we expect that to take a quarter or two to come back, in better shape and form. But till then, even just the utility, non-discretionary travel is a significant part of the market to help you, generate revenues and keep you going. So at this point, I'll say I'm fairly confident that we have enough capital to, see through the next 12 months, even if it takes 12 months to come out of this situation. And even beyond that, because we've been profitable, and we may turn profitable again, in a quarter or two if the things go the way they're going right now. Because I mean, what has happened now, people don't realize is that every company's unit economics have improved dramatically because no one is spending anything on marketing, right? So you don't need the same scale to turn profitable anymore, right? Because when you don't spend on marketing, you probably need just half or two-thirds of the scale that you were there at earlier, and you may still have enough margin to turn profitable again, right? So that's what our bet is, that we should be able to get back in the black, by the end of the year for sure again.
Alok, this has been amazing. Thanks for sharing your journey and all the amazing things you've done. Thanks a lot. It's been fun.
Thanks a lot, Varun, and great to have known you for so long, since your citrus days when we first partnered till today. I think still going strong, and good luck to you with all your endeavors.
Hey guys, thanks for sticking around till the end. Don't forget to subscribe and share the episode with your friends and those who you think may like the episodes. And if you haven't already done so, go to stars.substack.com and leave your email so that I can update you every time we release a new episode. Okay, stay safe.